Post-war era. What happens after the abolition of slavery? Reconstruction. The term Reconstruction era is in the content of the United States has two sentences. The first covers the complete history from 1865 to 1877, and the second sentence focuses on the transformation of the southern United States in 1863 and 1877. From the year 1863 to 1865, Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson both took the moderate positions designed to bring back the South black to normal. But the radical Republicans used the Congress to block any sorts of approaches towards the South. Under the administration of Andrew Johnson in 1865 and 1866, the black codes were restricted to control the labor of behavior of the former slaves and any other kind of African Americans. But later on, under the control of the radical Reconstruction in 1867, the blacks raised force against the government for the first time in American history, and even ended up winning the election to the South. However, reactionary forces, including the KKK, who would reserve the changes in violent methods to restore white supremacy in the South by hunting, killing, and torturing, which leads me to the KKK lynchings.
The Jim Crow laws was the racial caste system in the United States that primarily operated in the South from the 1870s to mid-1960s. In the 1870s, after the Civil War had ended, the Democrats gradually regained power in the Southern legislatures, having used military groups to get rid of the Republicans and scare blacks to withhold their votes. Close governor elections in the South resulted in the government pulling back the last of the federal troops from the South. Now, white Democrats had regained power politically in every southern state, which led to the introduction to the Jim Crow laws, officially segregating black people from the white population. Many people saw Jim Crow laws as a series of rigid anti-black laws, but it was more than that. It was a way of life. During the period of the Jim Crow laws, the black people got the status of second-class citizens. Many Christian ministers taught the population that the white people was the chosen people and that black people was cursed to be servants. Furthermore, according to the ministers, God supported the racial segregation. The politicians who supported the segregation started giving speeches on the great danger on the integration, and in both newspapers and magazines, the blacks were referred to as niggers, coons, and darkies. And it kept getting worse. According to the Jim Crow laws, whites were superior to blacks in all important ways, such as intelligence, morality, and behavior. Furthermore, sexual relations between whites and blacks would lead to a mongrel race, which would destroy America. Also, violence was allowed to be used against blacks to keep them at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. The laws also said that a black man could not shake hands with the white, since that would mean that the black was equal to the white. The blacks were not allowed to show any kind of affection in public, since it would offend the whites. And if a person drove in a car, the white person would be the one sitting in the front, while the black person would be placed in the back of the car. This was, as mentioned, a way of living for many, many years, but after approximately 15 years of segregation and suppression against the blacks started fighting back, and the first attempts to break the laws were shown.
The fall of Jim Crow. Throughout the years, there had been attempts to abolish the Jim Crow laws. First and foremost, there had been several demonstrations, and between these was the march in Washington by over 200,000 people in 1963. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964, and there had also been a lot of several small civil disobedience by, amongst others, Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat to a white person on the bus on December 1st, 1955. Up through the 60s, things started to change, and many new laws began to run over the already existing Jim Crow laws. In January 1964, the leaders of the civil rights met at a Congress, and the president at that time was named Lyndon Johnson. In his first State of the Union address, he asked the Congress to let this session of Congress be known as the session which did more for the civil rights than the last 100 sessions combined. And with the influence of his words, he signed the historic Civil Rights Acts of 1964 on July the 2nd. This document said to outlaw discrimination in public places, which meant things such as hotels, schools, workplaces, restaurants, and in stores. So actually, the Jim Crow laws never was officially taken down themselves, but instead they were overrun by laws which contradicted with them. All of those acts together finally abolished and ended the Jim Crow laws after almost 100 years.
Plessy v. Ferguson was a U.S. Supreme Court case upheld in the constitutionality of segregation under the separate but equal doctrine set in 1896. It stemmed from an 1892 incident in which an African-American train passenger, Homer Plessy, refused to sit in a Jim Crow car, breaking a Louisiana law. Rejecting Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the court ruled that a state law that implied merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks did not conflict with the 13th and 14th Amendment. Restrictive legislation based on race continued following the Plessy's decision. By a 7-to-1 vote, the court said that a state law that implies merely a legal distinction between the two races did not conflict the 13th Amendment forbidding involuntary servitude, nor did it tend to re-establish such a condition. The court avoided discussing the protections granted by the clause in the 14th Amendment that forbids the states to make laws depriving citizens of their privileges or immunities, but instead cited that laws in other states as a reasonable exercise of their authority under the police power. The purpose of the 14th Amendment, the court said, was to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, and required their separation. It wasn't necessarily to imply the inferiority of either of the races.
Yeah, so the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, was a secret right-wing extremist organization established in Tennessee in 1866. It was established by Southern states veterans with the purpose of bringing back the white supremacy. It happened by undermining local Republican governments in the Southern states and deprived blacks of political rights that were guaranteed to them by the Republican majority in the U.S. Congress. The methods developed quickly into real terror, where the KKK disguised themselves in white capes with high tops and did nightly blood rituals, whippings, abductions, and killings. The primary targets were black people and white people who was against the KKK. The Klan were formally dissolved in 1969, but continued locally, and the federal intervention was necessary. We will now show you a video where we see a black woman confronting racism by interviewing someone from the KKK.
You must have a vision for life. What's your vision as a Klansman?
I see it as I'm not a racist.
You're not a racist?
No, I'm not a racist.
Oh.
Nobody is a racist that is in the Klan.
No, but you are wearing like history. You're wearing like hundreds of years of threat and terror.
This is more for ceremonial purposes.
Lynching was the practice of killing, usually by hanging, resulting from extrajudicial mob action. Lynchings in the United States occurred after the American Civil War in the late 1800s. The emancipation of slaves, and chiefly from the late 1800s through the 1960s,
Lynching took place most frequently against African American men and women in the southern United States. Lynching occurred most frequently from 1890 to the 1920s, a time of political suppression of blacks by whites, with a peak in 1892. Lynchings were also very common in the Old West, where the majority of victims were African American men, but also some whites were lynched.
Thank you for listening.